So it's a little bit of a default acceptance. And then he really has to work to win the people round. And he puts a lot of effort actually into doing that. He starts to organize festivals and entertainments to try to deal with the rising food prices. He does he tries to make sure that he's quite careful about the way he runs the judicial system, for example. So there are lots of positive things. He's quite a populist ruler in a way. He makes an effort to appeal to the lower social classes. But yeah, as I say, there are always some people who are going to say, either on account of his birth or on account of the foreign military support, or both, that he's not really there because the people in Florence want him to be.
All right. I like that. Even in many countries of the world today, we have leaders that we wouldn't even want them to be there, but politics is a complex thing. When they talk of political assassination of president, of leader, even in the ancient time, sometimes it can even be the person was born there, he grew up there, he never went to any place, he had been there, but sometimes it can be killed too. So what I'm actually trying to drive at here is, since when this question of illegitimacy became an issue? Was it before Alessandro got to power, before he died, or after he died? I'm trying to understand how the story was actually constructed. Mm-hmm. Okay, to be very simple.
So already, even under his when his father Lorenzo was in charge of Florence, there are people criticizing Lorenzo, and there are people who write, people who are political enemies of the Medici, who are never nice about any of the Medici. They always criticize. They criticize Alessandro. They sort of say, oh, well, the Medici haven't got any legitimate children. They've only got these two little bastards. These, they're not. They talk about them as entirely unsuitable to rule, and they just generally don't like the Medici. They call them tyrants. It's perfectly true. Back in the 15th century, you go back 50 years before Alessandro, the Medici have been very extensively criticized. It's well known that they were helping themselves to state funds to support their private lifestyle. So it's not it's not the case that everybody always loved the Medici. Florence was very factional. It was very split. You have different sides. So when Alessandro comes in, one of the things I think we have to try and do is to disentangle a little bit which aspects of the criticism are general criticism that would have been applied to any member of the Medici family, and which aspects of them are very specific to him as an individual, to his race, to his social status, to the fact that he was not born within a legitimate marriage. All of these things, and it's often quite difficult to tell, because sometimes people who are really making political criticisms will also just throw in the fact, oh, his mother was Moorish, or oh, his mother was half Negro, this type of language. And they will say those things within the context of generally not liking the Medici. So it's sometimes tricky to pick out from that how your average person in Florentine society who wasn't very politically engaged might have seen Alessandro, because those people often do not leave behind a record of their political opinions. And the political opinions we have got are the most polarized political opinions from either people who are really trying to defend Alessandro, or the people who absolutely hate the Medici and everything they do is terrible. So for me as a historian, some of the process of writing the book is trying to take a historical record that has often been very, very hostile, and to take that, put it alongside the documents that we do have from the period, and try and reconstruct a little bit of what might potentially have been the point of view of Alessandro and his supporters, and indeed the point of view of just your average person in the street.
The point of view of the average person in the street. All right, now, if we look at the point of view of average person in the street in Europe today, okay, let's say Italy, because I live in Italy, I've been here since 2004. It will appear to a lot of people in Italy that probably they are seeing Africa for the first time. The average opinion of the people. Now, we're talking of many years ago, 50, 30, this is a lot of years ago,
Yeah.
a person of African origin or a mixed race become a duke. Was it something that is completely unheard of in Europe? France, Florence were doing it for the first time. I mean, what I'm trying to ask here is, are we really knowing ourselves for the first time? Or somehow we have entangled ourselves in a way that we are just pretending to be knowing ourselves for the first time? Help me understand this.
So the first thing I would say is that your average person in the street in Florence would almost certainly have seen Black people before, because we know from the decoration of the Medici palace that goes back to the 1450s, we have a portrait within that palace of a Black archer at the Medici court. So we know that there are people of African descent in Florence for 80 years before Alessandro comes to power. And we know that actually one of the interesting things for me was seeing, in the records that once I started looking, it's one of the interesting things that you're not sort of paying attention, and like suddenly I had never, was never particularly looking in previous research for anything that might indicate the race of a particular individual. But when I started looking, you do notice that there are more people. There are particularly African musicians, African dancers who are very popular at court in this period. So it's not absolutely the case that African migrants, mostly people who were trafficked as slaves into Italy, some of whom might have been freed, some of whom might not. But it's not the case that Africans would be entirely unfamiliar in the Florentine piazza. But obviously then you've got the question of how does that work when Alessandro is becoming a duke? And to what extent is that a surprise to people? I think it's a surprise to people to some extent, but the way they discuss criticism of him, it tends not to be in terms of race. And I think one of the things that's quite important to understand with this is that the modern terminology of race, like for example, the idea of a Black person that subsequently becomes very common in Europe, is really quite new at this point. It is quite new because it grows up and becomes used to justify what is happening in the transatlantic slave trade. And the idea of a white person is not going to really be around for a whole century after that. I mean, yeah, there is colorism and color bias and color preference, and this idea that a sort of fair pinkish skin is preferable to being more tanned amongst white people. But there isn't this quite sharp concept of race that you'll get later on. So I think in Alessandro's period, that helps us understand why it's perhaps not as, although it might be in later periods, is it quite surprising that somebody of mixed heritage could become a Duke of Florence.